I'm Benjamin Pollard with an episode of Chatter for August 14th, 2022. For today's episode, the team at Lawfare decided to cross-post this week's episode of Chatter, a podcast hosted by David Priess and Shane Harris that features in-depth discussions with fascinating people at the creative edges of national security. Today's Chatter episode is entitled Journalism as Fodder for Fiction with Mary Louise Kelly. In the episode, Harris sat down with Kelly to discuss how she got her start in journalism, her travels around the world, and how journalism influences her fiction writing.
This is Chatter. I'm Shane Harris. This week, Mary Louise Kelly on how journalism is fodder for fiction.
I remember sitting in Pakistan at the headquarters of ISI, their intelligence service, and one of them kept blowing the most beautiful smoke rings that were floating up to the ceiling, and then a peacock walked by the window outside, and I just thought, God, I should do something with this. Right. Like, what do you do with this? So you write it in your notebook and figure maybe one day. I had this moment in Baghdad, actually, where I hit the wall and thinking, I love my job, but right now this is not working. And on the plane home from that, I started writing what became my first novel. I spent a lot of time with anonymous sources trying to make it as perfect as I was capable of making it. And then it's really hard because you're so invested at the end when your editor comes back to you and says, this whole section didn't work, throw it out. I'm like, but I sweated blood over that section.
Mary Louise Kelly, welcome to Chatter.
Thank you. So happy to be here,
I'm
finally.
Yes, I know. We've been trying to work this out.
We have.
You've been writing novels and you've been broadcasting on this small thing called National Public Radio, some people may have heard of.
This little outlet, a few blocks from here.
Exactly. Local radio has a pledge drive going on.
We do. We're very proud of our local radio stations all over the country.
Absolutely. So you have been back in the studio recording now for how long? For
a month.
Things considered. Okay.
A month. We were very careful, and the last, from the before times, April of 2020, shut down our beautiful soundproofed, makes this job much easier studios.
It's a gorgeous studio.
Yeah, gorgeous studios. And all started broadcasting from our basements and guest rooms and closets and all the rest of it. My dog has made multiple appearances on NPR. My kids have made even more. The vacuum cleaner, on the rare occasions it gets run, the producers are like, can we turn that down? I'm like, nope. If somebody's vacuuming, I'm not getting it that way.
No, there's no
it's
way.
Going forward.
We're doing this now. It's live. It's happening.
But so finally, with everybody vaccinated and rapid tested and all the rest. We have been back in the studios since June.
Yeah.
And it's been fantastic. It makes such a difference to be able to see somebody when you talk to them,
Absolutely.
like my co-host, and
100%.
to have engineers and producers around. So that's been good.
Did you ever hear from listeners saying that they liked the dogs barking and the kids in the background?
It's funny. I mean, my ear is professionally tuned to what it's supposed to sound like, and I feel like you could really hear a difference when we were all at home. But most people can't. The mics are decent, the connections are good, technology is amazing. And there were some dogs that were developing real followings. Scott Horsley, our chief economics correspondent's dog, was particularly eager to engage in conversation, and he would, there'd be something, stock market crash, and the dog would be going nuts, and you just acknowledge it and, move on. But
it probably had a way of humanizing people, too.
Exactly.
Because otherwise you're just sort of this disembodied voice that's out there of authority, and now it makes you more familiar to people.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's nice. That's nice. So we'll talk about your career in journalism. We will talk about your career as a novelist, which we're very excited about since you have been writing spy novels, and we love to talk about that on Chatter. But first, let's talk about you. So tell us where you were born. Where did you grow up?
I was born in an Army field hospital in Augsburg, Germany.
Oh.
My father was drafted during Vietnam and was lucky enough not to get sent to Vietnam, but to go do Army intelligence in Bavaria. And his new bride, my mother, followed him. And then I came along a year or two later. We moved back to the States when I was 3 or 4. I grew up mostly in Atlanta.
Where in Atlanta?
I'm a Georgia girl, right middle of town. My parents, in Buckhead.
Like, really? Like right there?
In the city.
I grew up in East Cobb. Well, high school in East Cobb County in Marietta.
Okay.
Yeah,
so I was in Vinings
great.
For a long time during school. And
that's a great part of Atlanta.
So that's where I grew up, and that was my first job, like right out of college, was going home and being an intern for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, my hometown paper. And as you know, you get to... For me, it was like seeing a totally different city than the one that in my tunnel vision going to high school, focusing on sports and college applications and all that, to cover it as a reporter and go to neighborhoods I'd never even heard of, much less visited, was a totally different experience.
What was your first beat?
So I was an intern, and I covered things like sinkholes erupting in parking lots.
Yeah.
Then I was assigned to the political desk when I got a full-time gig, and I did like the night cop shift for Cobb County.
Okay.
We had a bureau just off the Marietta Town Square.
Oh yeah.
And it was a lot of monitoring the late night, what was going on the scanner, and getting called out to somebody's pet hyena had escaped and police were giving. I mean, it was some good stories. And then I got my really big break and was made the political correspondent for Dekalb County, so covering the Dekalb County Commission out of our Decatur bureau, and covering what was going on pertinent to Dekalb County out of the Georgia State House. So at the Capitol, following people around, I wrote a weekly column about that and chased down things like the garbage contracts for Dekalb County Commission. I made every mistake I think it is possible to. Well, I say every mistake. I've continued to find new ways to mess things up, but made so many mistakes that I was so fortunate to have good editors to save me from myself, walk me back from, help me figure out how you do this.
Yeah.
And it was just great experience writing on everything under the sun. And politics in Georgia gets crazy, which we have not lost sight of today in 2022, and it was crazy then in the 90s. So it was a great experience, but I knew I wanted to do foreign policy, international news, and that the Journal-Constitution probably wasn't going to be the best launch pad for that. So as I was doing that, already eyeing grad school, what comes next.
I see. And this is a time also in Atlanta, maybe people don't appreciate, the 90s are this incredibly dynamic, fast time. I mean, the Olympics were coming.
Yeah.
The suburbs were expanding. I mean, the city was really, becoming this kind of capital of the South, which a lot of people in the South, don't like that it was becoming that. So that must have been just an exciting time too. And Atlanta is kind of like looking out more to the world. So there is an international kind of flavor that's coming. Big companies are there. It's a transportation hub.
And I think that was, Atlanta had always been international because of it as a corporate hub. Yeah. It was already headquarters of Coke. It was already headquarters of Delta. But it was like the rest of the country and the world noticed with the Olympics coming to town and all of the building that transformed to this day downtown Atlanta.
Absolutely.
By the time I covered the Olympics in Atlanta in 1996, I was working for the BBC.
Wow. So how did you go from the AJC to the BBC?
I did by way of, I did a postgraduate degree in England at Cambridge and in European politics and history.
I'm sensing biographical themes that come back later in a certain novel, which we'll get to.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. And I toyed with applying to law school and toyed with being a management consultant and toyed with continuing in academia and getting a PhD and being some very lofty professor thinking deep thoughts. And in job interview after job interview, I kept thinking, I could do that and I'd be better paid, and there are advantages to some of those things, particularly management consulting, I'd be better paid. But I would walk into a newsroom and just feel alive, just feel I would pay you to get to do this. I remember walking into an interview at the BBC long before they actually hired me. I did not get this job, but they kept me waiting for 2 hours because some big story was breaking. And, the newsroom was going crazy and interns are running around screaming and the printers are like churning out smoke and everybody's banging in and out of studios. And I just sat there thinking, this is where I want to be.
Yeah.
So I talked my way into a 1-week internship, this cute boy who I was at grad school with, whose dad ran BBC Scotland, offered to hook me up with a 1 week unpaid, I won't even call it an internship.
1 week?
1 week, but following them around while seeing how they covered politics, because I didn't know anything about broadcasting either. How does that work? Would I like this? So that was in Glasgow. And I met somebody there who was on assignment from BBC Westminster covering Parliament. And I said, can I come do the same thing there? Can I follow you around for 1 week? Unpaid, absolutely useless. Yeah. But it was very useful to me because I looked at broadcasting and thought, I could do this. Yeah. I like this. And with those two on my resume, these two very impressive internships, I started applying around to BBC jobs, which I was manifestly unqualified for, and I further didn't have a work permit to work in the UK. But as luck would have it, they were opening a Boston bureau, partnered with WGBH, to launch a program called The World, which is a great international news program, which exists to this day, and they were hiring. So I applied, and some crazy person gave it to me, and that was the beginning of broadcasting for me.
Wow.
Yeah.
And were you sort of like doing general assignment work? Or?
I was hired as a producer to help get The World on the air every day, but it was great because it was a startup, and the big premise was we are going to cover the whole world, and we're going to do it with local reporters. We're not going to follow the traditional model that NPR and the Washington Post and every other major American news organization does of sending our American people overseas. We're going to hire somebody locally to tell us their story of their country and their patch as they see it. And to do that, we had to train people. So it was a lot of identifying a promising newspaper reporter in Phnom Penh, to take one that I took on, and then sending a producer there to train them. Here's radio gear, here's broadcasting gear, here's how it works. I teach you how to file for us. So they flew me all over, to Islamabad, to Peshawar, to the tribal areas of Pakistan, to Phnom Penh, to Thailand, all over. Initially training producers, but managing to find my way onto air in any way that I could, until eventually I was reporting and filling in the gaps of places where we didn't have people, but where we needed someone. So that was, this is the 90s. So Kosovo was erupting. The Balkans were at war. Northern Ireland was trying to find its way toward peace, and I was based in London by then. So I was traveling to Belfast regularly to file on that. And then ended up filling in some anchoring and hosting and kind of finding my way from there.
Did you kind of have it in your head that this is the life of a foreign correspondent and this was something really appealing to you?
Yeah. I then, as now, have always found it amazing that a career exists where I can fly somewhere, interview people who would never talk to me, who aren't going to take my calls, Mary Louise Kelly's calls, but they'll take the BBC's calls because they want their story out there. You know how this works. And the privilege of being able to go somewhere and see it and try to tell these stories and talk to people and then write about it and broadcast, and they're paying me to do this. I mean, it's the greatest job on earth. Yeah. I love it. I loved it then. I've had so many moments around the world. I remember traveling years later, but it's been so many times along the way, but stepping out onto a balcony in Amman in Jordan and looking out and just thinking, I can't believe I get to do this.
Right.
I love this. Right. I'm so lucky.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had moments like that too. And it's funny, you mentioned the energy of the newsroom. And when I first got into journalism, I'd spent most of my time in high school and college doing theater and writing for theater and performing and directing. And it was the strangest thing to then step into a newsroom where I had, no familiarity. I stumbled backwards into journalism. But there was a similar energy of people getting together, highly focused on one project or a set of projects. There's a deadline. We either get it out the door or get it on the air or get it on stage, or we don't. And then when we're done, we tear it all down and we start over again. And that kind of cyclical dynamic is something that I think is really appealing to journalists.
The fresh slate every day. Exactly. Like there are days when you just nailed it.
Yeah.
I mean, everything came together. Every interview you wanted came back. Yes, you came up with the perfect turn of phrase. It all comes together. And then there are other days where like if I had one more hour, hell, if I had 5 more minutes, I could make this so much better. But in broadcasting, you don't.
Right.
Like your deadline is in 17 seconds, and it's non-negotiable. And that can drive you crazy on days where it doesn't all come together. But on the other hand, it's done. You've done your best, and then you wake up and it's a clean slate. Was
it hard for you to develop like the I guess it's a technique you sometimes hear when someone's doing an interview and you know it's wrapping up and you've got to kind of start signaling to the person. Like you don't want to be rude, but
technique
it's like, come on.
is the polite term, I guess. And I need you to shut up now, Senator. Thank
you. Exactly.
Yeah, you do. I have found it's incredibly helpful to signal on air. Like in the minute we have left, we got 30 seconds left. I do that. It's on the one hand, you hate to waste 5 seconds to say that when you really have 1 minute left. On the other hand, it's telegraphing not only the person I'm interviewing, like, I'm going to need you to wrap this up, but to everyone listening. Because when I don't do that, the people who write in and are like, you couldn't have given Nancy Pelosi like 10 more seconds to finish her sentence. I'm like, I really couldn't.
Yeah.
It's to the second. Mm-hmm. And even if I'd given her 10 more seconds, you wouldn't have heard it because hundreds of stations across the country are cutting away to their local news, traffic, weather inserts. So you're signaling, I got to land this plane, people. And then you start doing the and that's a great point to end it on. Thank you, Shane.
Yeah, right. And I imagine if you're in the studio with somebody, it's easier too. You mentioned working for the BBC in Atlanta during the Olympics. Were you there to cover did you cover the bombing as well?
I did. It was just...
And there was the TWA crash at the same time.
It was a lot. Yeah, I remember the bombing because I had, I live in Atlanta, I lived in Atlanta. My family was there, but I was staying at the BBC Bureau, which was a house we'd rented so that everybody could share tape. In those days, it was literally tape. Like cut off and hand to someone or dub your cassette onto theirs. But I was working out of the Bureau. I had been working around the clock, the way one does when you're covering a major event and filing for all the platforms and outlets and shows around the clock. And I remember, I can't remember what day of the week the bombing was, but I remember it was my day off. So I had gone home the night before, crawled into bed and thought, finally, I'm going to sleep 8 hours. And then I remember my mom running into my bedroom and saying, they bombed the Olympics. They bombed the Olympics. And I thought, what? Okay, go. And it was so just, sad. But yeah, you cover it. Yeah. You keep going.
Yeah. So how did you make the leap then to National Public Radio? What was your entree into that? Because I imagine that too must feel like a big moment when you're going to this other. Well, you'd been at the BBC, so you'd been at an institution before, but now you're going to like the American radio network.
It was my husband and I, the cute guy who arranged the BBC Scotland interview became my husband.
Is that right?
So there was a happy ending to that story in more than one way.
I was wondering. I was going to let you get to it. I was like, is that him?
What happened to the cute guy?
Yeah.
He's British. He's Scottish. And we had been living in London. And because I married him, I had a work permit to work for the BBC. And it all came together. But we were both, I think, ready to look around and move on. In my case, because... sounding the way I do, with an American accent, I was hitting a glass ceiling at the BBC. It was becoming clear, like, I'm never going to get to anchor the evening news there, sounding like this. And I think the BBC, as with NPR, as with many other broadcasters, have grown more open to different accents and voices and people bringing their unique selves and regional accents and all the rest. Because my Southern accent was trained right out of me at the BBC.
Oh, interesting. It's undetectable.
I say y'all. I say Atlanta instead of Atlanta.
Okay, now it's coming
Atlanta.
Through. Yeah.
But yes, as a quick aside, I remember that stories when I was in Phnom Penh in Cambodia coming back, and I'd been to Angkor Wat, the ancient temples of Angkor Wat. And I was saying that, ancient temples, and I had a producer on the other side of the glass saying, did you mean to say ancient temples? I'm like, yeah, ancient temples. We had to do it like
what do y'all call them?
10 times before they would put it on air. And there were many. I could keep going for a while with the moments like that of, did you just say, hold on, back it up, back up the tape. So with my ancient temples accent, I was not going to anchor the 6 o'clock news in the UK, and I got really annoyed with some of my reporting out of Northern Ireland and Belfast, where it aired as I had done it on the World Service for international outlets, but for BBC domestic 6 o'clock news, they were voicing it over with someone who spoke the Queen's English, and that's frustrating when it's your own reporting. And I thought that's not going to work for me for the foreseeable coming.
It's like you were dubbed
years.
Basically.
Yes.
Wow.
I was dubbed right out of it.
Amazing.
So I started figuring out what that would look like, and I interviewed at the BBC in Washington at the bureau here, thinking maybe that would be more acceptable. But at the same time, NPR had a diplomatic correspondent job open based in Washington, but covering the State Department, foreign affairs, foreign policy, traveling. Which I decided I desperately wanted.
That is a great gig.
I did not get this gig. It had been promised to Michelle Kellerman, who to this day is our diplomatic correspondent and was trying to find a way back. She'd been our Moscow bureau chief and was moving back to the States. But they told me they wanted me, and they said, if you will come and edit our flagship biggest show, All Things Considered, if you can edit this for 2 years, we'll give you whatever beat you want. That was the basic deal. And I thought about it and thought, okay.
That's a pretty good offer.
It's a pretty good offer. And my husband had a job he was excited about to come to here. He's a lawyer. And so I took it, and it was great in that you edit a program like All Things Considered. I learned how NPR worked. I also just learned I had never covered national news in the States. I didn't know how Washington worked. I didn't know how covering the country worked. You edit a big show like All Things Considered, and it's like this crash course in that level of journalism. Because I'd done foreign reporting, I'd done local reporting, but I'd never covered America. So I did it for a couple of years, and those couple of years I came in early 2001. Of course, everything changed on September 11th of 2001. Changed, what we were covering, the urgency of what we were covering, how we aligned beats. And it also, as I was thinking, okay, clearly what I'm going to ask for is, another diplomatic correspondent job. I want to be covering foreign policy, which means I should be covering the State Department. But, in a story that may sound familiar to you, Shane, as I was watching, it just became more and more clear, I'm not sure all our foreign policy is being conducted through the State Department. There might be more interesting things to track going through covert channels, military channels. And NPR didn't properly have a beat then covering the CIA, the NSA, the intel committees on the Hill. We were covering it kind of through our White House and Pentagon and State Department reporters, but not full on. And so I made a pitch, we should have an intelligence beat.
Yep.
I have no idea what I'm doing on this beat, and I have zero sources. In fact, I don't even know the number for the press office at the Central Intelligence Agency.
At least you knew there was one.
Literally, I knew there was one, but I did not have the phone number.
Oh my gosh.
But you figure it out.
Yeah.
So they let me launch it, and I figured it out. I'm figuring it out. I should say this remain. I don't know that anybody's properly figured it out.
I don't think anyone
it's a work in progress.
Completely figures it out. And this is something that, when I tell this story about how I got into intel reporting, it's very similar to yours in that people often, they think that because those agencies are so thoroughly covered and, portrayed in popular culture that, this must be ages going back of people just tracking the CIA and covering it. But it wasn't really a beat because it wasn't something that kind of was in the conversation, and it very much liked to stay out of it. And you're absolutely right.
There was no Rolodex to inherit.
No, not at all. Yeah. And maybe just a few people. When I got into it, it was all formers who were basically my trail guides explaining literal mechanics of just, okay, there's X number of agencies, and this is the one that kind of, that back then the director of Central Intelligence, as the CIA director was known, kind of tries to harness them all together, but it doesn't really work. And so you kind of I had to get informed on this decades of history of these organizations, which had their own reputations and own kind of mysteries and whatever, to suddenly start reporting on that is, on a somewhat daily basis, is pretty intimidating.
It's pretty intimidating. And then add to that, for me, the challenge of broadcast, because it's one thing just to get somebody's phone number and then to get them to take your call and then to maybe help you in any tiny crumb of information, but to get them to put it on tape is next level. So I did a lot, the formers, the people who used to work there and are now somewhat more free to speak, the people who've gone to think tanks. I'd hear some little crumb and then I'd go to them and say, I don't know, what does this mean? What questions should I be asking? What questions do you have? Would you put those on tape? It's hard.
And when you had to conceive of stories, you were doing it not just what's a good intel story, but what's going to work on the radio. Yeah. So how does that influence the decision of what you choose to report on?
I did more what we in NPR lingo would call two ways than pieces. So a piece where, it's me narrating this fabulous story that I have uncovered, and you will hear from three people on tape through it. I just didn't have three people on tape most days. So it was a lot of, the anchor interviewing me as the then reporter, and every day just going back to that old thinking, I've glimpsed this tiny thing, which I'm sure is such a small piece of all these, this much bigger thing that I don't know and may never glimpse. But just going back every day to the what do you know, how do you know it, what do you know, how do you know it? And that felt like somewhat safe ground. And some days it really was not that much. And it was a lot of, here are the questions we have. Mm-hmm. Here's what we're trying to find out. Here are the questions that I think the committees on the Hill with oversight responsibility are trying to figure out. And those were all the days of, obviously everything that came in the aftermath of 9/11, from war in Iraq, Abu Ghraib, the 9/11 Commission and its investigations, which was a great opportunity. I'm not sure if you were on the beat by then, but it was this very rare moment where senior people who never spoke publicly, the head of the clandestine service at CIA was coming and testifying on the record, on tape, in front of this committee. Which gave me, to me, those 9/11 Commission hearings, which were day after day after day of live testimony, were my education of, okay, this is how it works. This is who this person is and how they fit into an organization and how, what questions they can take on from the White House, from the CIA, from the Pentagon, as they tried to figure out what went wrong. But everything that happened after that, from, the interrogation and detention programs in Guantanamo and everything else. Yeah. It was an amazing time to be starting that beat.
I wonder, too.
It was front and center every day.
Oh, every day. It was, and people kind of forget this, that agree to which after 9/11, the country was on a knife's edge for so long, thinking there'd be another attack. But these were the agencies that everyone was looking to protect us. Yeah. That said, okay, well, you missed this one on 9/11. What are you doing to get the next one? And I wonder whether those hearings, they certainly had a forcing effect in that you bring these people, as you point out, that never speak publicly, and now suddenly they're on live television. But I wonder, did it have an effect, too, of making the agencies realize that if they did put those people out there, they could start to tell their stories and sort of start to shape a narrative as well?
Yeah, and I think that remains the struggle for any of these agencies whose work, by definition, is almost entirely classified. Yeah. How much do you put out there? You see, and you see the pendulum swinging. With a new CIA director will come in and be a bit more accessible and put a bit more out there and remind people a lot of what they're doing is open source material. And then you'll see the next one come in and draw it all back. The most extreme example, I guess, being the previous CIA director before this one, Gina Haspel, who, to my knowledge, has never given an interview to a journalist. Nope. Ever. And I've tried.
Yeah, we've all tried. I've tried since she's left, and it's always, no thanks.
Yeah, and now you have Bill Burns, who is, because partly of his background as a State Department official who was used to giving interviews, he was more comfortable in that world. And I think, he's also, while he runs an agency that still should be facing and answering a lot of questions about actions that they have taken in past and are taking today. He wasn't at the agency for a lot of that,
right.
Whereas Gina Haspel was.
Right. I think he gave you his first on-the-record interview, right?
He did.
Not bad. So you're reporting on national security. You're learning the intel beat. At some point, you decide, maybe this would make a good novel. Maybe there's a way to render this in fiction. So tell me about when the worm starts turning that you think you want to also be a novelist and write about this world. And had you always wanted to write a novel?
I mean, who hasn't always wanted to write a novel?
I mean, most journalists.
Yeah, you think, I've got a story.
Right.
This would be fun.
Right. I can do this.
Yeah. And you do see crazy things on our beat, on the national security beat, that are in your head or in your reporter's notebook that can't find their way into, for me, a 4-minute story that I'm filing on the news du jour, but you pack them away, these moments. Little ones. I remember sitting in Pakistan at the headquarters of ISI, their intelligence service, and 4 of their spy chiefs lined up. And I'm asking them, it's just, years ago, but asking them about the hunt for bin Laden and how serious they were, and questions that remain relevant today about Pakistani support for the Taliban across the border in Afghanistan, and they're, insisting on their full and complete cooperation with the U.S. and their firm allegiance in the war on terror. And one of them kept blowing the most beautiful smoke rings that were floating up to the ceiling, and then a peacock walked by the window outside, and I just thought, God, I should do something with this.
Right.
What do you do with this? So you write it in your notebook and figure maybe one day I'll come back to this. I think the other 2 things, we talked about how fantastic it is that every day you get a clean slate in daily journalism. The flip side is it can feel ephemeral. You can do the most amazing story where the writing was great, the reporting was great, so great, but the next, by 2 weeks later, everybody's on it, so moved on.
And forgotten what you wrote.
And I had been noodling the challenge of doing something that might feel a little more permanent. That would last, like a book that you could put on a table and it's going to sit there, and your grandkids may never read it, but damn it, it's there. Right. You wrote it. And then there were just little moments. I remember standing in the shower and listening to the radio to Morning Edition, which at the time ran a series called Crime in the City. It was a great summer series trying to, fill some of the dead air in the traditionally slow news cycle of summer. And they interviewed novelists, mostly thriller and mystery writers, who tended to set their books in a certain place, and the reporter would walk around with them and let the author show them, here's the cafe where this happened, here's the river where the body turned up, here's the this, here's the that. They were great summer series, and I remember standing in the shower getting ready for work, and an interview with a writer called Cara Black came on. She writes murder mysteries set in Paris. And she's describing her routine, which is she cranks out one every year or 2. She does a 3-4 month research trip to Paris, and then she comes back and writes, and then she does book tour, and she starts again. And I'm sitting there shampooing my hair and call out to my husband, who's brushing his teeth. I'm like, that sounds so great. Why aren't I writing murder mysteries that require months-long research trips to Paris and then going on book tour? That sounds fun. He was just like, yeah, why not? And I was like, yeah.
Why not?
Why not? Mm-hmm. Why am I not doing that? And I had 2 little kids, and I was at the time covering the Pentagon beat and traveling constantly. And I had this moment in Baghdad, actually, where I hit the wall. A 4-year-old at home who was sick, and thinking, I love my job, but right now this is not working. Wow. And on the plane home from that, I started writing what became my first novel on the plane back to Andrews Air Force Base, as it was then known.
So your first novel, Anonymous Sources, it feels very much also like your kind of love letter to journalism. I mean, it's a spy thriller. It's a murder mystery. It's also a book about journalism.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody didn't know what it was like to do investigative journalism or crime reporting, or frankly follow any story, if they read your book, they'd basically understand it, of how they follow the leads and from one thing to another.
With some modifications.
Sure.
My protagonist kills one of her sources, which I've happily not done yet.
But so how did you think, okay, was Alexandra James already in your head, or were you like, okay, let's start with something I know. Let's make the narrative backbone a world I totally intimately understand. Because she, not unlike you, is a complete, like you were years before, she's a novice to this. She gets, through a murder, she gets pulled into this plot of intrigue involving the CIA and international terrorism and all that. So she's kind of the perfect vehicle for this, for even the naive reader to kind of have all of this revealed to them.
Right.
Did you know that you wanted to approach it that way, or how did that come to you?
I think this is all new to me. Yeah. I don't know how to write a novel. I don't know how to write fiction. I do know how a journalist goes about tackling a story where they get thrown in off the deep end. And so this is something that I can see as a vehicle where I could pull the reader along with me, figuring this out as she goes. And there were things about it that felt very familiar. Alexander and James are my two sons, and so I named my protagonist Alexandra James because I was missing the newsroom as I wrote it, and as I walked away from NPR to do this, and was trying to remind myself why. This is about your boys. This is about being home when they get home from preschool.
Right.
And doing something that I enjoy and find meaningful, but that is significantly more family-friendly than flying in and out of Baghdad. And then it became a vehicle for telling a story where I could have her lead you through it, and that felt the reader would be learning along with her. And I was also very much, because I did miss the newsroom, pulling on my reporting as I did this. I mean, I remember, that novel came out in 2013, and in the years before then, if you interviewed anybody in the national security world and asked them, like, what keeps you up at night? It's like either the nuclear threat or terrorism, and the absolute worst nightmare was where those two came together.
Right.
And the place they would often point you to was Pakistan, a place that at the time had the fastest growing nuclear weapons program in the world, and arguably probably the world's fastest recruitment of terrorists going on, with Al-Qaeda having fled across the border and hiding, as we now know, where they were hiding.
Right.
And so it seemed like the convergence, and seemed like, all right, this is something I could write about. If that's in real, I don't know if you remember, but in 2009, so early in the days of the Obama administration, there was a big scare about nuclear terrorism. CIA came and briefed. This was the Tehrik-i Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, and they were getting credible intel threads that they had somehow had a line out to or acquired or had a good lead on some kind of nuclear material. And this was obviously terrifying.
Yeah.
So what are we going to do about it? And I had flown to Pakistan on numerous occasions by then and had interviewed the head of the Strategic Plans Division, the SPD, who was like, it's foolproof, our security is foolproof, absolutely no problem, nobody could get a Pakistani nuclear weapon. But then around that time, wasn't it the headquarters of the Pakistani army had come under siege and been penetrated? There were all kinds of problems, and you think, I don't know how foolproof this looks.
Right.
As a reporter, I can ask questions, and American officials, once you turned off the tape and they wanted, you were speaking not on the record, would tell you how truly terrifying this is. And I thought, all right, let's go big or go home in terms of what my protagonist is going to have thrown at her.
Right. It's pretty big.
Let's have a Pakistani nuclear possible weapon on the loose.
Yeah.
See what happens there.
And she has, biographical experiences I alluded to earlier, where she'd studied at Cambridge, right? And there's a part where she goes back there, and you can tell that you're sort of dropping in these references to England and to London and to Washington that are really meaningful.
Places I know.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like a reporter's instinct. It's draw on what you know, and you kind of weave that into a tapestry. And she's a very, assertive character. She's using her brain, she's using her looks. And you write really unflinchingly about her and the struggles that she goes through and the traumas that she's going to have in her past. I mean, did you want to create this character where you're just pouring all of these things into, or did that just happen as you were writing it?
It happened as I was writing it. I mean, I created her, and there are definitely aspects to her that are totally me.
Yeah.
There are definitely aspects that are really not. The first draft that I handed to my agent, my agent totally didn't like her and also just didn't understand what was driving her and said, I can be rooting against her. There are plenty of unlikable protagonists of novels that keep you hooked, but I have to care what happens to her. I don't care what happens to her yet because I don't know her. There's no backstory. So I went away and spent months and months just thinking, what is her backstory? And most of it never finds its way into the novel, but I had to figure it out in my own mind to figure out, well, how would she react? And it got to the point where I would hear her in my head just all the time. Like I'd be at the dry cleaners trying to pick up my, shirts, and I would hear how would Alex James handle this situation? So I ended up writing a little bit more of a backstory than I had planned in terms of kind of how she was both just total chutzpah, just a total go-getter, no holds barred, but also fearless, very vulnerable. I remember having fun playing with, I'm sitting here talking to you in very unattractive running sneakers because I've sprained my ankle. But I do love high heels, and that is something that is me and Alex James.
The shoes, I was like, that's
some serious shoes. Yeah. She has great shoes, and that was partly because I like writing about fun shoes, and so she always had a good pair of heels on.
Right.
But I felt like if I wanted to figure out how she moved through the world, I kind of needed to know, what shoes is she wearing? And the thing about high heels, I will explain to you as a man, is they make your legs look so great. They're so empowering. You feel so confident when you walk into a room in a pair of killer stilettos, or at least I do. I'll speak for myself, in a way that you just can't replicate in your running shoes. However, they literally cripple you. You can't run after the bad guy or after the story while wearing high heels. So they totally are a thing. They're about vanity.
Yeah.
And something beautiful. And you are vulnerable in them because you kind of can't move. And that combination of the vanity, the vulnerability, but how empowering they are, that was all part of Alex James. And to me, it was a lot of fun and really satisfying to try to just, in little ways, capture that.
I wonder, too, I think you wrote about her in a way that felt just very personal and very realized. I don't know that I, as a man, would have the same. I don't think I would understand maybe women enough to write a character that fully, because she is vain, but she's also practical, and she's doubting, but she's hugely confident. And I liked that aspect of it. I liked that she very much leaned into her femininity in the book.
Thank you. It's also, I did, as I say, there are many things about her that are not me, but that were aspects of Friends or story, I felt confident writing her as a woman, as a journalist. It's more of a learning curve to figure out, how do I write, the man of color in a career I know nothing about, and make that sound authentic. But you have to, unless you're going to only write about
people like you.
People just like you. And that gets boring for me pretty fast, and I'm sure for the reader as well. And it gets to something, I try to do every day in my day job as an interviewer now, is I'm interviewing all kinds of people every day, most of whom are coming from a very different place, with a very different experience, with very different views than I may have. But you're trying to figure out, well, what makes you tick? Why do you think that? Mm-hmm. What's your story? That's interesting to me. And if I've done a good interview, you're capturing some common humanity, and what's important to somebody else in their world, in their life, what they've seen, what they want. And you bring some of that to fiction as well, trying to breathe life into characters who may be nothing like you, but imagining, well, what would their story be to make them act that way?
Had you read a lot of spy novels or thrillers in the genre before you decided to do one? Okay. Yeah.
This was another thing my fabulous agent pointed out was I sent her the first draft. This is before she was my agent because what I had written was so appalling.
So she's like, maybe I'll represent.
Definitely not taking this on. She's like, I can't tell you how to fix it, but among the questions she asked was, have you read a lot in this genre? I was like, no, not really, no. Yeah. And she was like, well, that's a problem if you're trying to write in this genre. You should maybe read some. And she, again, before she had even signed on to be my agent, she literally mailed me a box from New York, and it had Agatha Christie and Lee Child, the people writing today, people who were writing long ago, and she'd put a little Post-it note on the front cover saying, this is why I'm assigning you this. Like the Lee Child Post-it note was something to the effect of, you're not trying to write a book like Lee Child. Like you're writing a different kind of book. But read it, and you will tear through it because you can't help yourself because it's total page turner, and then go back and look at why. He does, if you start just, once you've torn through it and figure out what happened, go back and look at the end of every chapter. He ends each chapter in a way that it is impossible to stop yourself from going on and at least starting the next chapter. Right. It's just total, the hooks are into you. And when you read like several of his books and really study it, you start to see how he does it, which is not to say it's easily done, because if everybody could write like Lee Child, we would all be multi-gazillionaires and have written like Lee Child. But for each book she gave, there was another one that was, this person does character. Like, she will tell you 3 things about this character. You never find out what they look like or what they live, where they live, or anything about it, but you feel like you know this person because she's chosen that perfect, just 3 or 4 details to get this person in your head. And I read her book and thought about, okay, how does she do that? And I, can't say that I've mastered any of this, but it was instructive to me to figure out, this is what I'm trying to do. This is the way other people have done it. How could I do it?
It seems to me, I mean, that's fascinating, too, because I would have thought from reading anonymous sources that you'd read a lot of the genre, that you'd studied, like, literary and novelistic structure, because the book, I mean, it reads like a novel is supposed to read, and it does carry you through. So you either had instinct or you absorbed it. I don't know. I
think instinct, trial and error. Yeah. I do know how to tell a story, and this is, again, something you learn in broadcast. As a reporter in broadcast, I'm just trying to interview somebody and get the facts. And the interview can go for hours or can go for 2 minutes. I'm just trying to gather crumbs of information, which I will then shape into an arc, a story. As an anchor, my interview is going to stand alone. I have to give it an arc. I have to figure out where I'm starting it. I have to land it. There has to be some kind of closer, kicker. And you have to find your way through often a ton of information in the 4 minutes, 8 minutes in between. So you're thinking just constantly before you go into something, what's the arc? What's the arc? Where am I going with this? Where is this going? Who do I need to loop back to? Different writers do this different ways. I've talked to novelists who have massive storyboards with Post-it notes or, markers on their wall. And Richard Clarke, the former White House counterterrorism czar, who has since turned his hand to writing novels, told me he keeps like cards on the floor with each character and realizes if it's been 3 chapters since the purple card with character X made an appearance. Gotta get back to him. Gotta and that's how he keeps it straight. I'm less of a visual person, but I have in my head constantly, where does this need to go next? Who do we need to hear from? And then it's a constant trial and error. And I have learned as I've done more, it's the value of getting an absolute shit first draft on the page, if you'll excuse my language. I spent a lot of time with anonymous sources trying to make it perfect, or as perfect as I was capable of making it before I moved on to the next sentence, paragraph, chapter. And then it's really hard because you're so invested at the end when your editor comes back to you and says, this whole section didn't work, throw it out. I'm like, but I sweated blood over that section. More important, just get something down and come back to it. And maybe this whole section's going to come out, and maybe this whole section that you thought was the end ends up being the beginning. I don't know, but I haven't tied up all the neat ends yet, so I'm able to kind of rip it out and try it somewhere else or try getting rid of it altogether.
I think that's such important advice for writers. I mean, whether journalists too, but especially in fiction, where you just getting it down on the page is about 80% of the battle. The finesse can come later. It may be more obvious to you. But, the way that you can agonize over something only to have an editor come in and kind of rip it up again. I mean, first-time writers who are listening to this should take this to mind. Like, do not overinvest in it because it's going to change. And it should change, right? I mean, part of the writing of the first draft is you working it out and seeing what it looks like and what it sounds like before you can really start to think about what the whole story is.
And some of it isn't even the structure of the story, what's going to happen. Do you hear from this character, when you need to hear from them? Some of it is like, how much detail do you give? If I'm describing this setting today, and I want people to be able to see it and imagine and feel invested in this little studio where you and I are sitting with gray walls, the gray carpet stripes, and it's beautiful, clean, I don't know, what is that, pine table? Like, how much do you need to know that the table is pine? Is that bringing it to life for you?
Right.
Or is that a completely superfluous detail and just tell me what happened next?
Yeah.
And you're constantly writing fiction, trying to figure out, I feel like in my journalism work, just because I have so much more experience at it, I may not always get it right, but I have a sense of what details you need to know to carry you along in the story and keep your interest engaged. In fiction, I was like, Alex James is meeting somebody in this cafe. How much does she need to know about the cafe? Do you just care that it's a cafe? But I want you to picture it. Like, how much do you need to know?
Yeah.
And so constantly I would write this beautiful 4-page description of the cafe, and my editor would be like, it's just a cafe.
It's just a cafe.
And then the next one, I'm like, okay, she's in a cafe. She's like, but bring me there. What's the cafe? I'm like, but, and you don't always agree with your editor.
Right.
And they're editors for a reason because they make it better if you will let them.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, I also, some days say, I wrote it this way because I wrote it this way.
Yeah.
It needs to say this. And you're the author. It's yours.
Yeah.
It's your story to tell.
So when do you write? How do you divide your life between writing fiction and then hosting All Things Considered and doing the reporting abroad that you also do? I mean, you're off to Ukraine. You're still flying around the world and doing these big newsmaker interviews.
Yeah, which is one of the lovely things about anchoring at NPR is they really want the anchors to get out of the studio and into the world.
Yeah, that is nice.
And it then totally, obviously, informs the interviews you're doing when you get back. It's not easy, and I also have 2 kids still at home. But the writing of books is a labor of love, and so like most things you love, you figure it out.
Yeah.
My kids are been high schoolers this past year as I've been trying to write, and the very last thing I usually feel like doing after a long day in the newsroom and getting dinner on the table and unloading the dishwasher, all the stuff, is to sit down at 8 or 9 and write for 2 hours. I mean, it is really the last. I know that I love doing this, but actually getting myself to sit down in front of the screen and stop procrastinating and opening the mail and all the other things that are easier, it is hard. And I actually have learned a lot from my kids, high schoolers who come home from a full day at school, and then if they're both varsity athletes, a 2 or 3 hour workout. And they come home, and I think the last thing they feel like doing at 9 at night is tackling a couple of hours of homework. But they're sitting there doing it, and I would think, okay, if they can do this, I can do this. Mm-hmm. And then if I just start, I remember, oh, yeah, I love this. And I get into the zone and keep going. And at midnight, I don't want to go to bed and turn it off. I've tried that. I try getting up at 5 in the morning, trying to get in like 90 minutes before I need to start showering and reading in for the news day and all the rest.
Yeah.
And some days that works and some days it doesn't. Some days I'll get one good paragraph in, and it's so brutal to give up that sleep and think I got one paragraph.
Yeah.
But that's how you write a book. It's paragraph by paragraph, and it's going to take as long as it's going to take. And I also have gotten way less precious about, when I started Anonymous Sources, I must be in my full writerly zone and have hours cleared to just immerse myself. If you have another job and if you have family responsibilities, that's just never going to happen.
Yeah.
We all have a life.
Yeah.
So I carry around, I have with me in my bag right now a little red leather notebook, and when I'm sitting in traffic, when I'm in the grocery store checkout, when I'm in carpool line to pick up a boy. Can I write a sentence? Can I at least think like where this is going next? Can I Google the fact that I needed to look up before I can proceed? And this is, again, an argument for why don't worry if the first draft isn't perfect. It's not going to be perfect if you're writing it in the grocery store checkout line. There are going to be major bits that are incoherent. But you're getting something on the page, and it's easier to edit something than a blank page at 5 a.m, I will tell you.
Yep.
I also divide up there are moments when I have the space to feel really creative. Often I'll go for a run, and that's when you work up a sweat, your blood
cooking.
Starts cooking, and your blood starts circulating, and the idea that eluded you as you stared at your laptop screen will come into your head. So there are times when I'm creative. There are times when I'm able to take the creative idea and write something incoherent and bad, but it's something. And then there are times when I'm able to go back, look at the incoherent bad page and think, okay, this sucks, but I see that it's actually, halfway down where the interesting things start. So delete what came before, start there. Where can I go with that? And depending on kind of your energy level and your bandwidth, there are times of day that for me, I don't know why, but I kick into just great creative mode, like late afternoon. I don't know if it's my brain is conditioned for the all things considered schedule, like 4 or 5 o'clock, let's go.
Yep.
5 a.m, I have no creative ideas, just none. It doesn't matter how much coffee I drink. I have no ideas, but I can fact check the thing I wrote before.
You can sit down and do some work.
I can take the bad paragraph and copy edit it. I can do that, and that's something because that's an hour and a half of work.
You're reminding me of, I heard an interview once with our mutual colleague who, like you, is also a novelist and a journalist, David Ignatius.
Sure.
And he described a very similar process of somebody say, like, when do you write? And the answer was more or less, well, when I can. I mean, if you have a free 15 minutes, that's real work. And I think the trick is, and it sounds like you figured this out, is once you just start doing it and then the brain kicks into that mode and then you're in it, right? But you just kind of have to start it up and then you can go. And it's amazing what you can get done.
Well, I also called David Ignatius for advice
what did he say?
When I embarked on all this. And I asked him that very question, like, when do you write? And I remember he said, well, it's on the weekends. I don't play golf. Like, I don't, this is what I do on the weekends. And I just remember laughing and saying, well, your kids are obviously older than mine because my weekends are way crazier than my work week.
Yeah.
I'm so relieved when Monday morning comes around and I get to rest on my day job, which is what it feels like comparatively to having what at the time were very little kids racing from birthday party to soccer thing to, whatever. I thought, this is not going to get written on the weekends. Now they're older. I got some time on the weekends.
Yeah.
They don't wake up till noon. I got the whole Saturday morning to me and the dog sit there and crank out a chapter.
How many good hours of writing do you have in you in a day before just the tank is empty and you got to wait till the next day to recharge it?
I know a lot of fiction writers say they can really do whatever it is, 4 or 5 hours a day, and it's so intense that's what they can do, and after that it's just not productive. I don't know if I've been conditioned by just so many years of being on deadline and often sleep deprived on a big story, but I can write. If I have that time, I will grab it. And with every one of my books, this is now the third that will be coming out next year, I have carved out a few weeks off my day job and tried to take time to go away somewhere just by myself for a week or two and write like 18 hours a day.
Oh my God.
And I'm sure I'm not actually writing 18 hours a day, but I am writing from before dawn till
wow. That's intense.
Like into the night, because it's for this last book in particular where I've never tried to write a book while anchoring full time. It's a lot. And I just couldn't find my way to, as I say, you do it paragraph by paragraph, but this was going to take like decades at the rate that I was cranking out those paragraphs. And I needed to get some momentum to get me over the hump. And so I took a 6-week book leave and took one of those weeks and went away by myself and sat in a house by myself and talked to no one. And got enough written that I could start saying, okay, this is still a lot of work.
Yeah.
I still have so much left to write, but I can do this.
Yeah.
Like, I've broken the back of this thing.
Yeah.
I can get this done. But there's no way I could have done that squeezed in around the margins. At a certain point, for me, I need that uninterrupted space. And 6 weeks is not long enough to write a book.
Yeah.
But it was enough to get some traction.
That's great. And so now you have your third novel coming out.
Not a novel. This is more personal. This is nonfiction. Essays.
So like a memoir? Mm-hmm. Oh, fantastic. Do you want to say anything about it, or do you want to hold on?
It's about motherhood and journalism and the balance and the juggle, and how for me I have found that has gotten a little harder as my kids have gotten older.
Yeah.
Because the trade-offs seem more clear. When they were little, I missed a lot of stuff because I was traveling or working, but it always felt like there'll be more. Next year I'll figure out how to get all this right. Next year. And my oldest was a senior in high school this past year, and it dawned on me there are no more next years. I got no more do-overs.
Yeah.
If I'm going to show up, I got to show up. So I timed that 6-week book leave to varsity soccer season because both my sons play. And I wrote my butt off until 3 o'clock every day, and then I hit save and drove up and made every single soccer game.
That's amazing.
Or as many as I possibly could.
Yeah, I'm sure they appreciated that.
I hope so. I know, and this is the other thing. Of course it's for them. Of course it's about them. But it's that the trade-offs were becoming so crystal clear and undeniable to me.
Yeah.
I want this.
Yeah.
They may not even notice I'm up in the stands. They're focused on the game. But
Right.
I know. And I wanted to be there and not miss it.
And do you like... It sounds like you've figured out, like, life is a juggle, and it's a juggling act. And this is just as true for almost everyone. But do you like having this book writer part of you and also Mary Louise Kelly, the broadcast journalist and host? I mean, do you like holding them both together, or does one feed the other, or is it...
They totally feed the other. I love them both. They bring out different sides of what I can do, what I want to do, what I'm interested in trying to figure out and try to learn. I'm not great at trying to do them both at once. Somehow it gets done, but it's not pretty. But yeah, the reporting definitely feeds the writing. I couldn't write books unless I were doing my day job or had done my day job.
That's really interesting.
It's just so informs. I mean, what else am I going to write about?
Yeah.
You know?
No, I feel this way too. I've written 2 nonfiction books, and it's the same thing. It's like, but the day job is giving me all of this material to go do the book, and it almost feels like...
And the skills to write it, and the discipline.
Exactly. And we feel like you would almost... I mean, there's something, we had Daniel Silva recently on the podcast, and he talked about leaving journalism and doing a novel full time, and he's just cranking one out, every year, and it's expected and that kind of thing. But I think that you lose when you lose that kind of access to the reporting, which is so live and so current and visceral and immediate. To me, it's hard to imagine how you'd shut that off and still continue. You people obviously can do it, but I just think it's such a luxury to have that information stream to pull from.
Yeah. I also want to say, though, I'm not Superwoman by any stretch. Just ask my teenagers. They will keep you going for the next hour on the many fronts in which I am not Superwoman. And, it's the cliche. You can have it all, but maybe not all at once. But like a lot of cliches, there's a big old grain of truth in there. And I have cycled on and off the kind of high power on-ramp in journalism numerous times in the 18 years since my first was born. I took long maternity leaves. I took a full year when my second needed speech therapy, and I thought, I can't outsource this to the nanny. Like, he needs his mom. And then I quit altogether to focus on writing fiction during years where it felt like they needed me around. And then I missed the newsroom, and I cycled back in. But I have, I don't pick your metaphor, the on-ramp, the off-ramp, the juggle. It's okay to take time away and then come back, particularly when you're juggling small kids, because the title of my book is It Goes So Fast. Because it goes so fast.
Right.
And it feels, as I say, like you're going to be trying to make all this work forever, but then they grow up. They get taller than you, and my oldest is leaving for college in a few weeks. And it's okay to be in that moment too. Keep the doors open so that you can walk back into them when you're ready, because you'll be ready at some point to come back in and be full on. But it's okay to enjoy those moments.
It's a healthy lesson for people that you can toggle back and forth, and when you have a career that you enjoy, that you're good at, that welcomes you back, that's okay with that. I mean, that's I think some people feel, I certainly feel like this, that no, you have to stay on the track and keep running faster and faster and faster and higher and higher and higher and just add more tracks. But, we're not super people.
And the news is always there.
It's always there.
It always feels, as you know, like you've booked your, long anticipated vacation, and I mean, like the number, like the Mueller report drops, or a Supreme Court justice dies.
Right.
There's something where you think, I can't possibly miss this. But the news is always there.
Yep.
There will always be news. There will always be a big story, and you can step away from it for a little while. As I say, keep the doors open, but go do something else, and then come back if you need to, if you want to. And I have and have done.
Great. Well, in the few minutes we have left, see what I did there?
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
You signaled. He's going to cut me off. It's coming.
So our tradition on Chatter is the very last question of the interview is I reach into the chatter box, which is sitting right here before us right now. If I can actually get this thing open. And I reach and I select a previously written question at random. This is me shuffling through. So you're like a Foley artist now.
This is very impressive. Okay. It's coming out of the magic box.
Oh, now this is a good one for you. In what country other than your own would you most like to live, and why?
With all the caveats of, am I working, like in the newsroom, am I not working? Yeah. But I'll go with, life in 20 years when I'm not tethered to a studio and I'm writing the next great American novel while, looking out at the fabulous sunset. I'm struggling between Italy and Paris. Italy, my family has moved there back and forth twice with the boys. Because my husband and I visited Florence years ago and said, why do they get to live here and we don't? Like, the weather's fabulous, the food is fabulous, the wine is fabulous, people wear fabulous clothes, the soccer is fabulous. This mattered to my husband. The art is fabulous. Like, how come we have to go home and other people get to live here? So when I took sabbaticals and stepped away from daily journalism, I picked up the family and we moved to Italy, and my husband commuted to London, and we threw the boys into international school. And I very much look forward to doing that again someday.
Wow.
But then there's Paris, because who doesn't want to live in Paris? And I speak French, and I think that was one of those paths not taken. It's like there was a part of me, many years ago that thought, of course I'm going to live up in Paris and be a foreign correspondent based there and travel the world and have a cute French husband instead of a cute Scottish husband, and my kids would be speaking French, and that's the life. And I guess that has gone now, but that seed of thinking, the waking up in your little garret, throwing open the doors and walking down and getting your baguette and your truly excellent coffee. With apologies to Italy, I'm going to go with that French coffee is better. We'll just start a small war there. I'm a fan of the French press. Be one of those two.
Yeah, well, maybe in 20 years.
Plus, what great settings for spy novels.
Well, see, this is also what I'm thinking. I mean, you said a great one that takes place has some elements in London, which I thought maybe you might say London, because it's clear you seem to have a lot of affection for London, or maybe Alex.
I do. But see, I could commute easily to London from either of these. So,
just hop on the train, very easy.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, for now, we're very glad you're here. We're very glad you were here with us, Mary Louise Kelly.
Shane Harris.
Wonderful
writer. Been a total pleasure. Thank you.
Wonderful friend, wonderful broadcaster. Thanks for doing it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter @ThatWasChatter.